I'll just say that it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the content of this symposium, and the quality of the presentation so far really made it worthwhile. I hope you agree. Really nice presentations. Not to mention your weather and the venue are absolutely gorgeous, so I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you coming back from lunch. I have until, I think, 12:45, so I'll do my best to keep us on schedule here.
We have a fair bit of time built into the break.
Oh, you should not have told me that.
About 16 minutes.
I'll move along. You'll hear a continuation on a theme, and so I won't belabor that. AAALAC, the AAALAC Council, back when the 2011 guide came out, was very intentional on this topic. And not in a big way, but in some detailed ways, it was sort of uncharted waters as to how we would evaluate programs, given the new language in the guide. And I'll give you a little bit of idea of what they wrestled with when we come and show up on your door to do an AAALAC site visit. In a nutshell, the council said this really isn't new for us. We've always looked for social housing all along. And in fact, if you go to the 96 guide, the previous edition, you can find language that is very specific and very similar language in the revised 2011 edition. So again, maximizing species-specific behavior, minimizing stress-induced behaviors, and the like. Conspecific social interaction, hierarchies, and wherever appropriate, they should be housed in stable pairs or groups. Well, pairs or groups. I think the stable is new. This is old language. This is the language we used when we carried the guide in to evaluate your program. So if you look at that, in some ways, this is not a very big change in direction when you look at the 2011 guide. Pat did a nice job of summarizing this, so I won't belabor it. So there's existing language. It's very similar in the current edition of the guide, but the language is far expanded. And you can sort of see here I've referenced how much more language is devoted to this topic of social housing in the 2011 guide. It's clearly a nudge to us all to say we really need to sort of push the boundaries and think about how we house socially compatible, or animals that are social by nature, either by species or gender or whatever, how we consider their needs and we care for them in the scientific environment. There were several excerpts from the guide that sort of jumped out at the council in 2010 or 11 when we were looking at the new guide and saying, okay, what's it say? What new do we have to do when we evaluate programs? Single housing should be the exception, should account for the animal's social needs, housed in stable pairs or groups, compatible individuals, unless there's good reason for exemption. Again, not new language. So the council then developed what we call a position statement, which for AAALAC, we have relatively few of these. This is a statement for the organization to set a direction on which we will take doing accreditation site visits. It's sort of broad. It says we're going to think about a topic, in this case, social housing, in this particular way. So it's broad language. We started getting a lot of questions about our position statement, which happens to be approved by the AAALAC Board of Trustees, by the way, scientific organizations and their members. So we also wrote an FAQ, so I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. I've sprinkled in AALAC findings here, probably in my feeble attempt to try and keep you awake as we march through the afternoon. But I think this is interesting. This is, if we analyze all the findings we describe at site visits, at the exit briefing, we look at your program in these 6 main components: animal environment, occupational health and safety, the IACUC, veterinary care, physical plant, institutional administration, the support given by the institution. The 3 largest categories of findings you see there on that pie chart are animal environment, occupational health and safety, and the IACUC. Occ health and safety and the IACUC have traditionally sort of topped the list in the largest proportions of findings that we describe at the exit briefing. That was not a surprise to me when we calculated this data. Animal environment was. That's never been the top of the list. The only reason it's the top of the list and findings since 2011 is social housing. So clearly we've sort of ramped up our examination of how you approach social housing, and clearly we had a ways to go. About 23% of the findings in that blue piece of the pie relate to social housing and environmental enrichment, mostly social housing. So that's what sort of put that blue section, animal environment, at the top of the list. I think that's changing, and I'll describe more about that later. That's that 23% there, that dotted line. So that AAALAC position statement. We really labored over what words to use here, and we landed on default. And we've argued what that really means time and again, as only the AAALAC Council can do. But there you have it. That's the language of the position statement. We expect that to sort of be your knee-jerk approach to housing social animals. If you do house animals individually, it should be for good reason. And again, Pat did a good job of explaining this. This language comes right out of the guide. They're either incompatible, there's veterinary concerns, or there's scientific necessity that dictates their individual housing. And when single housing is necessary, there are other things that we think you should do in order to make their housing conditions as social as possible, given that they're not together full-time 24/7. And individually housed animals should get periodic review by the attending veterinarian and the IACUC. How are they doing? Do we still need to house them individually? How is this going? The periodicity is up to you, but that was an obvious intent on the council to do that. It's simpler for me to sort of wrap up that whole position statement sort of this way. If you're going to house social animals individually, it should be on purpose and intentional. And you probably ought to have a well thought out, probably even documented reason for doing that. If you don't, then that's that sort of 23% of the findings in that blue piece of the pie. On to the FAQ. Para-group housing is recommended, and by that we mean 24/7. We agree with Dawn when she said we don't think protected contact is really social housing, and the council debated that, but ultimately landed at the same conclusion. But the FAQ goes on to explain that, it's not an all or none question, really. It's either isolation or full-time social housing. It's a little bit more granular than that. And so a spectrum of activities might be considered. So if they are singly housed, that you maintain visual, olfactory, conspecifics, all the things that we've sort of thought of over the years as being important to maintain their well-being. So that's a step in the right direction towards full-time housing. Protected contact, yeah, that's probably a little bit more step, although we've seen that there's probably less and less, I think, data to support why this is absolutely necessary, other than a step to full-time housing. So I really like the presentations this morning that talked about that. And then this notion of part-time. So if you can't do it all the time, can you do it part-time? I'll mention some challenges we see associated with rabbits that comes as no surprise to you. We see this approach emerging as maybe something that might be doable. So I've mentioned when there is single housing, these other strategies we like to see employed. So this is really a conversation between the investigator, the attending veterinarian, and the IACUC about how you'll house the animals. And if they are singly housed, that's not the end of the conversation. What other things might we employ to improve their overall well-being? So anything to elicit appropriate behaviors in a context that's relevant for the particular species, in consideration of their psychological and physical needs, sensory, motor. The Ag Guide really has what I think are some very interesting terms, this social enrichment or occupational enrichment or physical enrichment to satisfy the senses of the particular animals in question. I think that's a real nice description of a way to think about how to enrich the environment of animals that are housed singly. And then, of course, positive human contact, increased monitoring of behaviors. I will tell you that if we come to do a site visit and we see a lot of mice, I don't know what a lot is, but at some point it will hit our radar screen and say, gosh, we see a lot of individually housed mice. Hopefully the IACUC's approved that, done that intentionally rather than accidentally. But if we see aberrant behaviors, we're going to ask if you've seen that. So are you monitoring those behaviors? What's your level of concern about those behaviors? What's your approach to deal with those behaviors? So if they're backflipping mice or a lot of aberrant behaviors in dogs or whatever, we're going to ask you about that. And has that conversation occurred? And what do you think and what do you do about that? So we think that this conversation at the institutional level is really squarely on the shoulders of the IACUC. It's up to the IACUC to set the institutional direction and approach on how you will set the social housing conditions for animals. And we've had a lot of conversation with institutions about, well, how do you do that? So the IACUC's going to have a policy about social housing, but it's kind of hard to do because programs are big, there's lots of species, there's individual variation, sometimes sex matters. You're not going to necessarily house boars together or stallions or breeding bulls, perhaps, or maybe even C57 black male mice. So are we expected to document every decision of individual housing that might occur on our campus? Take a campus like UC Davis. That's a monumental task. And our answer, quite simply, is no, you don't necessarily have to do that. Some institutions do that on a protocol-by-protocol basis. They want a scientific justification. They want a description in the protocol. That's their comfort level about how they've considered the social housing versus individual housing question. That's up to the institution, if you want to do that. It's a lot of work. My former institution, we had 38,000 mouse cages, and we had a lot of problems with fighting male mice. And so if we had done that on a case-by-case basis, protocol-by-protocol basis, it would have been a lot of work for the IACUC to sort of think about those male mice each and every protocol. You can do it with institution-wide policy. Look, we're not going to house breeding boars together. They just fight. We've tried various strategies. We've thought about it. We've made an intentional decision that this just generally doesn't work, so we're going to approach it in this way. We see that from time to time, and that's perfectly fine. It shows the institution was intentional about a particular group of animals in which group housing was difficult or impossible. Other considerations. We don't expect institutions to just sort of put on their blinders and march down this path asking questions about what's appropriate for animals without considering the sort of the global picture. Don't forget about the science and their duration on study. I've fielded many questions. Say, I'll bring up the rabbits again. We have rabbits that are on study for 2 weeks, and it takes us 8 months to train them to get along. But we've done that. And you have to ask yourselves a sort of a cost-benefit thing there. For a 2-month or 2-week duration study, is it appropriate? I don't know the answer to that, but it's a worthwhile question. What is their normative behavior? We have the sense, or I think we've been guilty of, say, well, social housing, group housing, means the nirvana where you don't have conflict. And you don't have to think about that very long before you realize that's really impractical. So what is their normative behavior? Do they fight in the wild? Is there conflict? Is there aggression? And most of the time the answer is yes. So if we expect some higher level of performance, if you will, by these animals in our environment, that's probably not realistic. Again, their social repertoire and aptitude. I'm guilty. Former institution years ago, I guess we were ahead of the curve. We had a PI that was willing to try and house New Zealand white rabbits socially. So we embarked on that exercise knowing nothing. We had a fair degree of success, but one of my own sort of biases coming in was, well, we have 70 New Zealand white rabbits on a handful of studies. They're all white rabbits. They're all the same size. We have males and females. They're all going to behave the same because they all look the same. Yeah, the folly of that is self-evident, but I sort of had that expectation. And when we tried it, we thought, gosh, they sort of act like individuals. Some are grumpy and some are friendly. And so I think we can't ignore that. And hence comes the labor involved in making this successful. One thing that I find interesting, and I really found interesting about this morning's talks, is how do we know if we're succeeding? So we put them together and we say, aha, we're done. What have we accomplished? Is it better? I don't know the answer to that. How do you measure that? What's the impact on the animals themselves? If you've really increased aggression and social conflict, is it better? Maybe not. Is it better for the science? Maybe yes. We've heard very good presentations where it is. Maybe not. I think those are really important questions, and that involves the investigator at the very fundamental level. We can't lose sight of that. And when you do manage conflict, what's acceptable and what's not? Carol alluded to some of that. We don't know the answer to that. That's a huge gray area. But when do you call it and you say, we have a grumpy macaque here who we're just not having any success with. So managing that conflict when it occurs is tricky. Another data slide or two here to sort of put the social housing issue in perspective. If we look at that animal environment section of your program, we have these major categories. I don't know if you can read that, but it's husbandry, sanitation, behavioral social management there in the middle, microenvironment, which is the pen or the cage, and macroenvironment, which is the facility or the room. And the relative percentage of findings in each of those categories. So when we consider all findings, suggestions for improvements, and mandatory issues, social housing issues are right there in the middle. If we focus, however, only on mandatory findings, social housing issues are the top most often cited finding in the animal environment part of your program. Nearing 60% of all mandatories in animal environment relate to social management. Translated, what that means, and I think this is changing. After that 2011 guide, heightened awareness about social housing, we were basically asking IACUCs during site visits, okay, we've seen a number of rats that are singly housed. Is that on purpose? Or is it by accident? And it wasn't uncommon for IACUCs to say, we don't know. We hadn't really thought about those rats. Or name the species or name the condition. So there were animals that had sort of fallen off the IACUC's radar screen. And we said, look, the guide's really ramping up expectations here, so you really need to think about how you will potentially socially house those animals. And if you haven't done that, AAALAC would require you to have that conversation. Again, not requiring you to socially house all animals, but require you to consider the social needs of all animals in your program. So those were mandatory findings. I think if we were to reanalyze the data, say, this year versus initially after the guide came out, 2011 guide, we're seeing less and less IACUCs sort of in that, with that deer in the headlights look. They're saying, yep, we've thought about it. We have a few animals individually housed, and here's why. And then we say, fine. As long as you've thought about it, you've made the active decision to do that, that's our expectation. So I think the number of social housing mandatories is really dropping quite significantly today compared to, say, 5 years ago. IACUCs are really getting up to speed on this. But if you look at this data set, behavioral and social management was the third most commonly cited mandatory deficiency in all aspects of your program, only behind HVAC and only behind occupational health and safety. So this was very common. Over half of all mandatory findings in that blue piece of the pie, animal environment, relate to social housing. As I said, I think that's dropping, but this has been a very common issue that we've dealt with. Pat's covered this. I'll be brief. I'm coming up on my time deadline here anyway. We see programs continually challenged by those pesky rabbits. They really are a challenge. We just don't know a lot about rabbit behavior, I think. We're beginning this journey, and we've tried a lot of things that don't particularly work, and we're honing in on some things that I think may work. You'll probably hear a lot about this tomorrow, and I won't profess to know about rabbits other than I've had my own frustrations as a veterinarian trying to deal with that. In some ag operations, with gestation crates or farrowing crates, confinement operations, some production research mimics what happens in the field, and this really challenges IACUCs. So the researchers said, well, I have to put them in farrowing crates because that's what's real in the world, and so that's what it is. If I don't put these sows in farrowing crates, then I have a problem with actually the validity of my results. We see programs struggle with that, and there's no easy answers with that. Programmatic uniformity, that means considering all species and whether or not they need to be social housed. And caging, like Carol aptly said, if you don't have adequate cages, if they're not large enough to accommodate more than one animal, that's an insufficient justification. We gave a period of 3 years after the 2011 guide for institutions to change their caging to accommodate social needs of animals. So there was a grace period. We called it a temporary suggestion for improvement, meaning 3 years later, that would become a mandatory issue. And for the most part, institutions have responded to that and acquired caging that accommodates social housing. We find that while the social housing concept is easy, the practical matters of implementing that are really rather challenging. And I will end with So this is a nod to my colleague, Jeff Wyatt at University of Rochester. He's a council member. He did a really nice review of rabbit group housing literature. And so this is a ridiculous summary. You'll get much more important information, I think, tomorrow. So I sort of borrowed some of this commentary from Dr. Wyatt's review of what was, by and large, really old literature, but really fascinating to read. Much of it in Australia, much of it in the 60s, although some of this is contemporary. I think there's a paper in here by Dr. Mensch, who's here at UC Davis. So it sort of runs the gamut, and some of these take-home points with regard to rabbits, these particularly challenging animals currently. Socially behavioral domestic rabbits is largely comparable to that seen in wild rabbits. Most of these Australian studies, interestingly, involved acres of land and anywhere from 30 to, say, 60 or 70 rabbits in the warren. So this was a huge territory they had, but yet they were documenting very common problems that you all see when you try to group house rabbits. They have a very rigid, linear inherited hierarchy of dominance with severe fighting. When they fight, they do not mess around. Male-to-male aggression typically is very common after sexual maturity. Female-to-female aggression appears to be more burrow protection related, particularly among unfamiliar does. If the group of does is familiar, there tends to be much less aggression, although they have these periods of, I think the literature called it crankiness. That was a funny term. Irritability, perhaps, associated with estrus or the breeding season. That probably surprises no one. It occurs in many species. I'll not comment further on that. Many of these early papers from Australia noted that the seasonal anestrus that occurs, and there's some debate about whether or not that's physiologically an accurate term, but they called it seasonal anestrus. You tend to see much less aggression. And so there might be some interesting strategies there with regard to light cycle and housing, perhaps. Aggression increases with density. Duh. We've all seen that, but I don't want to show. Yeah, I'm technologically challenged here. I'll bring it back. Many of the papers described specific behaviors in rabbits that were socially housed that they described as these comfort behaviors, sneezing, stretching, yawning, head shaking, versus singly housed rabbits that exhibit sort of aberrant behaviors, hair chewing, bar chewing and licking, head weaving, cage frustration and the like. And in some cases, one paper mentioned that providing free choice hay can really promote these sort of comfort behaviors, resting and getting along. So we see a lot of institutions struggling with rabbit social housing, and I think when you review the literature, it's no mystery why. I think we've got a lot to learn. And so if we have this symposium, say 5 years or 10 years from now, we'll be way further down the path, I think, with rabbits than we currently are. And that's it. Thank you.